Hello, my name is Carla Battle, and today we're going to be discussing the history of Atari and sort of their rise and fall. So, in the picture to the right, we can see two people. These are the founders of Atari. There are two engineers that worked at a company called Ampex in California. To the left is Ted Dabney, and to the right is Nolan Bushnell, who he actually was very fascinated with the very first video game, Space Wars, which kind of inspired him to work with Dabney to help create games together. And in 1971, Bushnell and Dabney would create the first coin-operated arcade machine. You can see it in the image to the right. That's kind of what it looked like. It kind of looks a little funky, in my opinion. The game was called Computer Space, but when it released, it was actually sort of a failure. It wasn't very popular, but it did make them enough money to leave Ampex and create their own company, Sazki Co., on June 27th, 1972. But they would discover that the name was already taken, so they would change it to Atari Inc. So there you go. After they started the company, the two would go on to create Pong, which would eventually become a very, very popular game. But while they were working on it, they hired, some fellow Ampex employees, one being Al Alcorn, who had never seen a video game before this, but despite this, they made him the senior engineer. So I think that's kind of funny. And to the right, that's kind of what the arcade sort of looked like. Yeah, when it released to the public, it was a massive success, selling over 8,000 machines in just a few months. It's very, very popular. And in 1973, Dabney would leave Atari. This was probably due to an increased competition growing in the gaming business and just a falling out with the whole company. And that's kind of a picture of what he looks like, when he got older. And around this time as well, companies they saw Pong's success and started to make copycats of it. So Atari started to create their own games to combat this, such as Space Race, Gotcha, and Breakout, which, fun fact about Breakout, that game was created by two engineers that would later go on to form Apple. That's right, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak created the game and would go on later to form Apple after this. So that's a very interesting fact. Also, around this time, Bushnell wanted to expand the company internationally, which almost bankrupted Atari. So it took the smash hit game Tank and the merger with the sister company Key Games in order to basically save Atari from financial disaster. Atari wanted to create their very own home video game console, which could play multiple games at a time. So, in December 1975, they hired Joe Desir, I think that's how you pronounce his name, to debug the hardware, which would eventually become the Atari VCS, aka the Atari 2600. The project was codenamed Stella and was worked on throughout 1976 to 1977. But, as they were working on it, they began to run into a massive financial issue since it costed a lot of money to make it. So, Bushnell would sell Atari to Warner Communications in 1976. So it seemed like a really good merger in the beginning. And it was, with Warner pumping in $100 million into Atari and Project Stella. The Atari VCS would release in 1977, which it shockingly in the beginning had an incredibly slow start. And, despite making $120 million, they still lost money on the game console. Now, eventually this console would become one of the most successful consoles ever to exist, but it had a very rough start. Extremely rough start. In 1978, Warner's executive vice president, Manny Grenard, was quite frustrated with the VCS sales and Bushnell's behavior. So they, after many, many disagreements, Bushnell would eventually get himself fired from Atari and would leave in November 1978. And he would be replaced by Ray Kasser, who was a lot different from Bushnell. He was more business smarts and business work environment, very serious instead of the more laid back, environment that, a lot of engineers were used to. And he also canceled a lot of engineering projects, which he deemed to be unnecessary, which would eventually open the door to competitors. And I will say he did really help Atari business-wise, but the very same decisions that Kasser made would eventually lead to Atari's downfall. And also, just due to the change in work environment, this led to a lot of engineers being incredibly frustrated. So many of them would leave, Atari, with some even going on to create their own companies. One in particular being Activision. In 1979, the VCS would actually see an explosion in popularity, selling 1 million units. In that same year, Atari would sell the 400 and 800 series, which were home computer versions of their video game consoles. And due to all the success, they decided in 1981 to start creating a successor game console codenamed Sylvia. And this console would be later called the Atari 5200. Now, around the end of 1981, Atari was massive. They were worth 1.1 billion in sales, and they owned about 75% of the video game industry. They were massive. However, at the exact same time, a flood of very low quality software and games started to kind of jam up the market. And a lot of it was coming from Atari themselves. It's kind of a quantity over quality situation. And they did see success in 1982 with the Atari now being rebranded to the 2600, selling 10 million consoles. The excess would eventually run out around the turn of the next year, with the most infamous example of these bad games being to the right, which is the E.T. video game, which is basically known as being one of the worst video games ever created. And in 1983, the video game industry would crash. Due to all the overflow of bad games and software. This would hit Atari extremely hard, with them losing over 300 million in the second quarter of 1983. And due to this just video game market crash, they couldn't sell games, so they had to dump over 700,000 games in a landfill in New Mexico. After the crash, Atari would never truly recover. After, the whole incident, the home consoles became very popular, which, made the 2600 and the 5200 quite outdated in comparison, since, it was older technology. But what really killed those consoles was when the Nintendo Entertainment System released in 1985. Also, arcade started to kind of fade out at the time, which just didn't help at all. And eventually, in 1984, Warner would sell the home computer part of Atari, and in 1985, they would sell the arcade part, kind of dividing the company. And Atari as a whole would die multiple times throughout the decades, so the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, but their final death would occur in January 2013 when they filed for bankruptcy again. Now, my thoughts on Atari and just their whole situation at hand, I really think that they should be recognized for their contributions and achievements to the gaming industry and just digital media as a whole. But I also feel like their story should be a lesson and a reminder about, greed, poor decision making, and it doesn't matter how large or powerful you are, you can lose everything in a moment. So to be very, very careful and make good decisions. Thank you for listening and watching my PowerPoint presentation about the history of Atari.